A granite mountain, a crowd gathered for a quarter-millennium birthday, and buried inside a 28-minute speech. 3 sentences that are still rewriting the terms of this entire conflict in real time. If you think what was said at Mount Rushmore on the eve of the 4th of July was just a throwaway applause line at a rally, you have fundamentally misread how this specific war has been communicated and what those exact words were doing simultaneously in Washington, in Tehran, in Doha, in Ankara, in Beijing, in Moscow, and in every room right now where someone is trying to figure out what happens next. It is July 6th, 2026, 3 days after that speech. And today, while millions of Iranian mourners fill the streets of Tehran for a 6-mile procession marking the 3rd day of a 6-day state funeral, chanting for vengeance beneath red banners that symbolize a call for blood retribution, the American president's words from that night are still being clipped, translated, broadcast, and weaponized across every faction of Iranian politics simultaneously. Not as propaganda, as evidence. And depending on which faction is doing the weaponizing, the exact same 3 sentences are proving 2 completely opposite things at once. That is the specific kind of strategic communication most coverage misses entirely. So let's not miss it. Start with what was actually said, because precision matters here. Standing beneath the carved granite faces of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Lincoln, on the evening of July 3rd, on the eve of the country's 250th birthday, the American president said this: "We knocked the hell out of Iran. They're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice." That was it. 3 sentences inside a much longer address focused mostly on American history, ideology, and a warning about what the president called a resurgent communist threat ahead of the November midterms. And yet, those 3 sentences are now the single most analyzed piece of communication to come out of this entire conflict in weeks, because each word inside them was doing specific strategic work across audiences that are not hearing the same message. Let's build this out completely, because the gap between the official framing and what's actually happening in the rooms we can't see is where the real picture lives. First, the backdrop, because in strategic communication, the setting is never decoration. It is content. Mount Rushmore, on the eve of America's 250th birthday, is not a neutral venue for a foreign policy statement about Iran. It is arguably the most symbolically loaded piece of political real estate in the country. 4 presidents carved permanently into granite, monuments to historical permanence, representing the founding, the expansion, the industrial transformation, the preservation of the republic against internal fracture. Standing beneath them to talk about Iran places that conflict in a very specific historical category, not an ongoing crisis, not an uncertain, fragile negotiation still being fought over line by line in a hotel conference room in Doha. A chapter already being filed into the permanent record of things America has already prevailed over. Granite, permanent, finished. And the timing compounds that framing. America's 250th birthday is a moment of maximum national emotional priming, a crowd already feeling pride, already primed for narratives about American strength and historical destiny, dropping the Iran line inside that specific speech, at that specific location, for that specific crowd, on the eve of that specific anniversary, is not incidental. It's a calculated bet about how to cement a particular narrative into the national consciousness during the single, most emotionally resonant civic moment the country has experienced in 50 years. Now, parse each sentence individually, because they're each doing something different. We knocked the hell out of Iran. Past tense, completed action. Not, we are knocking. Not, we have been engaged in knocking. Done. Finished. The grammatical choice places an active military confrontation, one still producing consequences right now, still shaping a ceasefire currently being disputed in Doha, still generating an active inspection standoff at a secret underground facility called Pickaxe Mountain, still being enforced by naval assets that have not drawn down from the theater, into the category of a resolved historical event. Won, filed, done. They're dying to settle. They want to settle so badly. This is the characterization of every Iranian diplomat, every technical negotiator currently sitting in Doha, trying to work through the implementation details of a memorandum neither side can fully agree on, as a party so thoroughly defeated they're desperate for relief. Not a negotiating partner, not a sovereign actor pursuing its own interests through diplomatic channels, a beaten party dying to settle. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice. This is where it gets geopolitically extraordinary in a way that extends far beyond crowd reaction at a rally. We gave them, not we observed, not we respected, not we paused in recognition of a humanitarian moment. Active voice, America the subject, Iran the object. America made a decision about what Iran was permitted to do with its grief, and on what schedule. And the framing of this is niceness, almost offhand, transforms an extraordinary geopolitical claim into something a crowd receives as casual generosity. Of course, we could have continued. We chose not to, because we're the kind of superpower that grants you a week to bury your dead before returning to the business of finalizing your defeat. That's what those 3 sentences actually said. And what followed the next day was, if anything, even more striking. Speaking to Axios the following afternoon, the president was asked about the extraordinary concentration of Iran's surviving senior leadership currently gathered in one place for the funeral, and responded with a line that's since been picked up across nearly every outlet covering this story. "They are all there," he said. "One shot, and we can take them all out. But we're not going to do that, because then we would have nobody to negotiate with." Sit with that for a second. The President of the United States, during a diplomatic pause specifically intended to let Iran bury its former supreme leader, publicly stated that his country has the capability to eliminate the surviving senior leadership of Iran in a single strike, and then explained explicitly that the reason this isn't happening isn't restraint, isn't international law, isn't diplomatic norms. It's the practical calculation that you cannot negotiate a deal with people you've just killed. The target is preserved, the restraint is instrumental. And the whole statement was delivered not as a threat, but as something close to a casual observation about a choice being made in real time, while the coffins were still moving through the streets. Iran's diplomatic missions abroad condemned the remark in the strongest terms available to them, describing it as a display lacking basic civility and historical respect. Iranian state media called it grotesque, and the hardline factions inside Tehran needed essentially no time at all to start weaponizing it. But here's the part. Most coverage is getting wrong. The reaction inside Iran is not uniform, and the difference between how different factions are actually processing these 2 statements tells you almost everything about where the Doha talks genuinely stand, and how likely they are to produce something real before the clock runs out. Here is the Iranian internal political reality, as of today, laid out plainly. There's a pragmatic faction, the sitting president, the foreign minister, the parliamentary moderates, who genuinely want to close this deal, unlock the country's frozen financial assets, restore oil export revenue, and use whatever economic recovery follows to rebuild domestic legitimacy in a country where inflation is running close to 70% and food prices have climbed to levels ordinary families feel every single week at the market. This is also a country whose security forces crushed mass protests in December of last year with lethal force, killing civilians and driving the underlying anger underground rather than resolving it. There's a hardline faction, the Revolutionary Guard's senior command, the most ideologically rigid members of parliament, the hardline clerical establishment, who view the memorandum as outright national capitulation, who have already pushed through legislation banning international inspections of any site struck during the war, and who treat every foreign slight, every triumphalist American statement, as fresh ammunition in an internal argument that settling with Washington isn't pragmatism, it's surrender. And caught between those 2 factions, technically sovereign over both of them on paper, is a new supreme leader who has not appeared in public a single time since taking the position. Iranian officials and a regional diplomat have told American outlets that Mojtaba Khamenei, the son who succeeded his father, is not expected to attend the funeral at all, a decision Iranian authorities attribute strictly to security concerns following explicit threats from Israeli officials. But the security explanation sits alongside a separate, harder-to-avoid set of facts. American defense officials said in the spring that the new supreme leader had been wounded and likely disfigured in the strike that killed his father, mother, and wife, and subsequent reporting has described severe facial and leg injuries, with some accounts suggesting a possible loss of a limb. He has communicated with the public exclusively through written statements read by state television anchors. He has never appeared on camera, never been heard speaking, not even at his own wife's funeral last week. Iran's health ministry has publicly insisted his injuries are merely superficial cuts, a claim that sits awkwardly next to nearly every independent account of his condition. Analysts who track Iran's internal power structure have been blunt about what his actual authority looks like in practice. He may hold the title, but his position and his survival both depend on the Revolutionary Guard, which means, functionally, he answers to them as much as they answer to him. What that means for the Doha process is straightforward and uncomfortable. The pragmatic negotiating faction is trying to close a deal it may not have the authority to actually deliver. The hardline faction, which does hold the practical power to block implementation, has already demonstrated both the will and the legislative capacity to do exactly that. And the one figure who theoretically has the standing to force alignment between those 2 camps cannot physically appear even at his own father's funeral, let alone assert direct control over a fractured security apparatus in the middle of an active negotiation. Now put the Mount Rushmore speech back into that context, and watch how the same 3 sentences produce 2 entirely opposite effects inside the same political system at once. For the hardline faction, That speech is the single most useful piece of evidence they've received since the memorandum was signed. We gave them a week off for a funeral because we're nice. Clip it, translate it, broadcast it everywhere. The American president is publicly describing the mourning of Iran's supreme leader as something he personally permitted on a schedule he personally set as an act of generosity from the winning side. That framing gets used in every internal argument against the pragmatic negotiating track from here forward. Look what accommodation actually produces, the hardliners will say. This is what settling looks like from the American side. Not mutual respect. Not a dignified resolution between two sovereign states. Charity extended downward, on terms the stronger party has decided to be gracious about this particular week. The one-shot comment makes this considerably worse for the pragmatic camp's case. Even during a week Washington itself designated for mourning, the American president is publicly discussing the option of eliminating the entire assembled Iranian leadership and explaining that the only reason it isn't happening is tactical inconvenience. That is humiliation fuel in the purest sense, and in factional politics, foreign humiliation functions as gasoline. But, and this is the part that's genuinely counterintuitive and rarely stated plainly, the Mount Rushmore speech may also be quietly serving the pragmatic faction's interests in a way that careful, diplomatically calibrated language never could. Here's the mechanism. The pragmatic faction needs to convince the hardliners that the strategic situation has genuinely permanently changed, that continued defiance now has a hard ceiling, that the balance of power on display is real rather than propaganda. They've been making that argument against hardliners who spent years operating on the assumption that American resolve would eventually crack, that sustained pressure campaigns would produce concessions, that the Islamic Republic could simply outlast whichever administration was currently applying costs. A president standing at Mount Rushmore declaring Iran defeated and desperate hands. The pragmatic faction, the most powerful possible external validation of exactly that argument. It becomes much harder for hardliners to claim, in their own internal debates, that Iran currently negotiates from strength when the American president is publicly characterizing the country as beaten and much of the international community is accepting that framing with only muted pushback. In authoritarian systems facing exactly this kind of internal fracture, domestic political cover for accommodation sometimes comes more effectively from an adversary's public triumphalism than from an adversary's diplomatic respect. If the pragmatic faction can point to Mount Rushmore and say to the hardliners, this is how the world currently sees us, this is the position continued defiance actually operates from. Rejecting accommodation means accepting this humiliation permanently rather than trading it for economic recovery and a path back to international standing, that argument can carry real weight. Whether that effect or the humiliation fuel effect ends up dominating inside Iranian factional politics over the coming weeks is genuinely unknowable from the outside. Both are real. Both are operating simultaneously right now, and the outcome depends entirely on internal dynamics that nobody outside a very small circle in Tehran can currently observe with any confidence. Now let's talk about the nuclear dimension specifically, because this is the piece of the story that's being almost completely buried under funeral coverage and Mount Rushmore soundbites, and it's the piece that actually determines whether anything signed in Doha is worth the paper it's printed on. There is a facility in Iran known as Pickaxe Mountain, sitting roughly 1 mile south of the main Natanz nuclear complex, buried deep inside a mountain in the Zagros Range that stands considerably taller than the ridge that once sheltered the Fordo enrichment site. Construction on it began back in 2020. International inspectors have never once been granted access, and when pressed on its purpose, Iranian officials have effectively told investigators it's not their concern. Satellite imagery reviewed by the Institute for Science and International Security, published just days ago, shows continuing vehicle activity on roads leading to the site's western tunnel portals, along with visible work reinforcing and hardening the tunnel entrances themselves, indicating construction inside the complex is actively ongoing rather than paused. The memorandum signed on June 17th explicitly requires Iran to maintain the status quo of its nuclear program, which analysts say should prohibit exactly this kind of construction at any nuclear-related facility. Pickaxe Mountain is unambiguously a nuclear-related facility. Construction there is continuing. Inspectors are not being allowed anywhere near it. And separately, the International Atomic Energy Agency has not conducted a single verification activity inside Iran under its safeguards agreement since February 28th, the first day of the war, when Iran expelled its inspectors entirely. The agency's own reporting states plainly that Iran remains the only non-nuclear weapon state under the Non-Proliferation Treaty to have produced and stockpiled uranium enriched to 60%, and that the lack of verified access to that stockpile for nearly half a year now represents a genuine proliferation concern. Iran is believed to hold somewhere in the range of 400 to 440 kilograms of that material. Weapons-grade enrichment sits at 90%. The technical gap between where that stockpile currently sits and weapons-grade material is significant, but it is not, according to the analysts tracking this closest, an insurmountable one, particularly for a hardened facility that continues to see active construction and continues to refuse any outside verification. Iran's parliament has separately passed legislation specifically banning inspections of any facility struck during the war, framing the ban as a matter of principle, insisting the International Atomic Energy Agency must first establish clear rules governing post-strike inspections before Tehran will accept any renewed monitoring. The head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization has told reporters explicitly just this week that inspections will not be permitted until such a framework exists. That framework does not currently exist, and building one from scratch would take time the negotiating window may simply not have, which means the exact inspection ban the memorandum requires Iran to lift is currently being sustained by an Iranian legal and procedural argument that the deal itself has done nothing to resolve. This is the gap between the public narrative and the operational reality. The vice president said last week that talks in Doha were going well, and that discussions specifically addressing the nuclear question would begin soon. Not have begun, would begin soon. The nuclear issue, the actual reason this entire conflict started in the first place, is being described by the administration's own vice president as a forthcoming agenda item, rather than a matter already substantively resolved. Meanwhile, commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz remains running at roughly a third of its pre-war volume. And Iran's own ambassador to China stated just days ago that Tehran will, in his words, definitely charge fees on vessels transiting the strait once the current 60-day free passage window closes, though friendlier nations might receive what he called special treatment. That statement runs directly against what Washington has publicly said it will accept, and it tells you plainly what Iran intends to do the moment this specific clause of the memorandum expires. Now, Turkey enters this picture in a way that adds real complexity to an already overloaded board. Turkey's president spoke publicly this past weekend at almost exactly the same moment the American president was delivering his Mount Rushmore remarks, warning that Israel's current government must not be allowed to, in his words, drown the region once again in the smell of gunpowder and blood, and stating plainly that Turkey was closely watching what he described as Israeli attempts to sabotage the deal. That is not a small statement. Turkey is a NATO member. Turkey has been actively positioning itself as one of the region's indispensable mediators throughout this entire process. And Turkey is now publicly accusing Israel, a close American ally, of deliberately working to undermine the only diplomatic framework currently preventing a return to open conflict. That's an active operational complication for everyone trying to hold this deal together, not a rhetorical footnote. Iran's foreign minister has separately warned this week that any Israeli attack during this period would be met with what he called an immediate and powerful response, while also describing Washington as having committed to restraining its closest regional ally. Israel's defense minister, for his part, has publicly marked Iran's new supreme leader for assassination for a second time in 4 months. And in the same 48-hour window, the American president said both that Iran is dying to settle and that its entire assembled leadership could be eliminated in a single strike if Washington simply chose to do it. Every one of those statements is on the public record. Every one of them is being read by different audiences with entirely different implications. And the Doha talks, which mediators had described as making genuinely positive progress before the funeral pause, remain on hold until the mourning period concludes, with the nuclear issue still described as something that will start being discussed at some undefined point soon. Here is what is actually observable right now, stripped of all official framing and narrative management. The deal signed on June 17th has roughly 40 days remaining in its 60-day window. The nuclear question has not been substantively addressed in the talks so far. Pickaxe Mountain remains under active construction, with the vehicle activity confirmed just this week by independent satellite analysis. IAEA inspectors have had no access to Iran's nuclear facilities since the war began in February. Iran's parliament has legally banned inspections of struck facilities pending a precondition the agency has not yet met. Iran's new supreme leader was reportedly advised by his own security apparatus not to attend his father's funeral, while 3 of his brothers appeared publicly in his place. The hardline factions are actively using the Mount Rushmore speech as ammunition in their internal argument against accommodation. The pragmatic factions are trying to close a deal they may not have full political authority to actually deliver. The American president has publicly acknowledged the capability to eliminate the assembled Iranian leadership and stated the only reason it isn't happening is negotiating utility. And Turkey's president is warning openly that Israel is actively trying to blow the entire agreement apart. That is the complete picture, not the official story, the observable one. And now the most important question, the one Mount Rushmore raised without ever answering, and the one the coming weeks will resolve one way or another. Is this administration actually negotiating for genuine, verifiable nuclear security, or is it negotiating for a deal it can simply describe as victory? Those are not the same objective, and conflating them is exactly how a fragile arrangement quietly curdles into something far less than what it appears to be. A deal that produces a public Iranian commitment to abandon nuclear weapons development, paired with commercial shipping visibly moving through the strait again, is probably sufficient to validate the Mount Rushmore narrative back home, regardless of whether it includes the kind of verifiable, inspectable, genuinely enforceable compliance that real non-proliferation actually requires. The triumphalist framing built over the past several days needs a deal that looks like Iranian capitulation. It does not strictly require a deal that verifiably eliminates Iran's nuclear weapons capability. And the inspection ban, the ongoing construction at Pickaxe Mountain, the roughly 400 kilograms of enriched uranium that international inspectors currently cannot independently verify or account for, all of that represents exactly the kind of gap between the genuine security requirement and the narrative requirement that a sufficiently motivated administration could simply choose to characterize as a detail to be resolved in follow-on talks somewhere down the road. Whether those gaps get closed or quietly papered over in the weeks ahead is the specific question that determines whether whatever eventually gets announced out of Doha is a genuine strategic achievement or managed ambiguity dressed up convincingly as one. Let's widen the lens for a moment, because most of the analysis around this story has focused almost entirely on Tehran and Washington, and the international dimension of what that Mount Rushmore speech actually communicated is being significantly underweighted. China was watching closely. Beijing holds enormous economic interests tied directly to Iranian oil, and the earlier closure of the Strait of Hormuz cost Chinese industry significantly in energy prices, shipping delays, and downstream manufacturing disruption. China also maintains a long-term strategic cooperation agreement with Iran worth hundreds of billions of dollars. When the American president stands at Mount Rushmore and describes Iran as a defeated party desperate for settlement, Beijing is quietly running the math on what that framing means for the future value of its own partnership, and what a genuinely desperate Iran might be willing to concede that touches Chinese commercial interests. Beijing's public posture throughout has been to call for diplomatic resolution while carefully avoiding anything resembling direct support for Iranian military operations, but the subtext of a sitting American president casually discussing the operational feasibility of eliminating an entire foreign leadership in one strike lands in Beijing as concrete data about current American confidence and capability. Every American ally across the Indo-Pacific is processing that same data point, whether it concerns Taiwan's security calculus, South Korea's, or Japan's. Russia carries its own separate stake in this. Moscow signed a multi-billion-dollar agreement with Iran last year covering new nuclear reactor construction, concluded at a moment when Iran still held considerably more regional leverage than it does today. The Mount Rushmore framing of a defeated, desperate Iran changes the strategic context of that partnership in ways the Kremlin is undoubtedly evaluating carefully. A weak and economically desperate Iran is a fundamentally different kind of partner than a defiant, nuclear-adjacent one capable of credibly threatening Gulf oil flows, and Russia's interest in Iran has always been partly instrumental, a pressure point usable against broader Western interests. A version of Iran that is dying to settle serves that function considerably less effectively. Saudi Arabia, meanwhile, appears to be doing something very specific, while global attention sits fixed on the funeral, the normalization track Riyadh had been pursuing. Before this war disrupted the region, is reportedly being quietly recalibrated against a dramatically changed Iranian reality, one running close to 70% inflation, missing its senior naval leadership, missing the architect of its Hormuz blockade doctrine, governed by a supreme leader who cannot appear even at his own father's funeral. That is a fundamentally weaker regional actor than the Iran that was negotiating from proxy network strength less than 2 years ago, and Saudi officials are recalibrating in real time, with the Mount Rushmore speech serving as one more data point in that ongoing calculation. European governments are watching with an anxiety that public statements aren't fully capturing either. Several NATO members had already been publicly critical of the American and Israeli campaign, but those same governments cannot afford another extended stretch of Gulf energy disruption. The earlier spike in European gas benchmark prices during the height of the blockade wasn't an abstraction. It drove real domestic energy cost crises and genuine political instability across the continent. European foreign ministries are reportedly working the phones right now during this funeral pause, positioning for whatever the post-deal environment ends up looking like, while simultaneously trying to read whether American triumphalism reflects genuine confidence that a deal is about to close, or confidence that Washington is fully prepared to keep applying pressure indefinitely if it doesn't. Those are two very different scenarios to be positioning for. And there's one more audience receiving the Mount Rushmore message that deserves far more attention than it's getting: the Iranian people themselves. There's a genuine, difficult question buried underneath the images filling Tehran's streets right now. The crowds are real, the coffins are real, the chanting for revenge is real, but a country of roughly 90 million people contains enormous internal variation. People genuinely grieving, people performing grief because the social and political cost of visibly not performing it is simply too high. People watching quietly from their own apartments, feeling something complicated that isn't fully captured by either mourning or secret celebration. The protests that shook the country in December of last year were crushed with lethal force, but the underlying conditions that produced them, economic misery, political repression, the widening gap between what the state promises and what ordinary families actually experience, haven't improved since. If anything, they've gotten measurably worse. Inflation, near 70%, is a daily material reality for ordinary Iranians in a way that no amount of funeral ceremony can paper over. When a clip of the American president's Mount Rushmore remarks reaches ordinary Iranians through social media and circumvented restrictions, it produces something genuinely different from what it produced in a crowd in South Dakota. For some, it functions as humiliation fuel, rallying them behind the regime's own narrative about foreign arrogance and disrespect. For others, it lands as the first plainly honest external description of a war their own government has spent months characterizing as a strategic victory, now described bluntly by an outside power as the defeat it actually was. Both reactions coexist simultaneously inside a population that has lived through months of war, economic collapse, and a violent government crackdown on its own citizens. The regime is fully aware of this tension, which is exactly why this funeral is being managed with such extraordinary precision. Controlled mourning, revolutionary symbolism layered over private grief, crowds encouraged to chant for vengeance as a collective act that expresses genuine anger while simultaneously demonstrating loyalty to a system under enormous internal strain. Which brings the entire picture to the observation almost nobody is stating plainly enough. The Mount Rushmore speech, the dying to settle framing, the one-shot comment, the we gave them a week off language, together represent a specific and genuinely uncertain gamble about how triumphalist public communication affects the actual closing mechanics of a fragile deal. The bet is that visible American confidence accelerates the pragmatic faction's push toward accommodation faster than it empowers hardline resistance. That is not an unreasonable bet. There is real historical precedent for demonstrative shows of strength-producing negotiating partners who conclude that continued resistance has simply become too costly to sustain. But the counterargument carries equal weight. Triumphalist language that publicly frames an adversary as defeated hands that adversary's hardline factions, the single most effective domestic argument available for why any accommodation amounts to national humiliation, raising the political cost of settlement for every pragmatist who now has to defend the deal to a public that just watched their country described as dying for mercy. In a system where the nominal head of state cannot even appear in public to force alignment between competing factions, that hardline argument carries real operational weight that more carefully calibrated diplomatic language might have helped neutralize. The gamble is real. Its outcome is genuinely uncertain. And the coming weeks will tell us whether it was strategic genius or a miscalculation that Iran's hardline factions are actively loading into every argument against ever closing this deal. What can be observed concretely right now on this specific day is this. The Doha talks remain paused until the funeral concludes later this week. Construction at Pickaxe Mountain continues, confirmed by independent satellite analysis published within the past several days. IAEA inspectors remain locked outside every relevant facility. Iran's supreme leader remains unseen and unheard in public since the day he assumed the role. The hardline factions have their humiliation fuel loaded and ready. The pragmatic factions are racing a ticking clock they may not survive politically. Roughly 40 days remain in the 60-day window that began on June 17th. And somewhere between Mount Rushmore's granite certainty and Tehran's red flag funeral processions still moving through the streets today, the actual resolution of this conflict is still being written in rooms that nobody outside them can currently see. The speech said Iran is dying to settle. The real question is whether dying to settle and actually being able to deliver a settlement are the same thing. Because as of today, the evidence for the second half of that sentence remains considerably weaker than the evidence for the first. Watch Pickaxe Mountain. Watch whether the supreme leader appears in public before the funeral concludes and the burial takes place later this week. Watch whether the IAEA gets any real movement on facility access before the 60-day window runs out. Watch what Doha actually produces in specific, verifiable, observable terms, rather than optimistic characterizations that can't be checked against a satellite image. The granite is carved. The speech is on the record. The processions are still moving through Tehran's streets today. And the weeks that determine whether this turns out to have been a premature victory lap or an accurate description of how this conflict actually ended are only just beginning.